I completely resent all of these political leaders for putting our lives at stake rather than sitting down and negotiating, which is their damn job, because they are to represent our interests, not their games.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Buitink, and welcome to another episode of Reinvent Money, where I discuss geopolitics and money with the best experts in the world. And today I'm honored to have economist Jeffrey Sachs on, who's a professor at Columbia University in New York. With Mr. Sachs, I will discuss the challenges of Europe and his proposal for peace in the awful wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Welcome, Mr. Sachs.
Good to be with you. Thanks so much.
It's an honor to have you on. I've been following you closely over the past few years. And I'm excited to be able to talk to you in person. I first learned about your work through the writings of Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek Minister of Finance, who relied on your advice during the Euro crisis. So you have an in-depth knowledge of the workings of the eurozone. Do you expect a new Euro crisis?
Well, Europe can avoid a Euro crisis if it wants. The crisis with Greece was a kind of contrived crisis. Germany wanted to bring Greece under its heel, as it were. It used the European Central Bank to do that. Actually, it created a massive run on the Greek banks just at the time of the referendum of Tsipras a few years ago. So it was a political move. And politics and money are intertwined, as I think is a theme of your podcasts. So the eurozone can work if the underlying politics of Europe works. If the European politics is pulling itself to pieces, then the eurozone doesn't function. So I regard this not as a technical set of issues, but as a matter of regional politics and global geopolitics.
Yeah, and some people say that, especially also I think in the US, prior to the launch of the euro, that the euro cannot be sustainable in the long run because it doesn't meet the conditions of a optimal currency area.
I participated in those discussions. That's how old I am. So I wrote papers back in the 1980s and early 1990s, pointing out that the United States, for example, has a federal fiscal structure. When one state gets in trouble, it pays less taxes to the center and it receives more transfers from the center. And so there's an evening out through a federal budget. Europe doesn't have a federal budget. Obviously, that's been one of the issues of debate for the last 50 years in Europe. There's a little bit of a Brussels-based budget, about 1% of the GDP of the European-wide economy. It's not enough for any kind of stabilization. And so there are deeper tensions in the eurozone than would be the case if Europe was a federal state, that's for sure. But there was a second feature, which is that the dollar or the eurozone holds together if the central bank acts as a lender of last resort, because financial markets are intrinsically unstable. They're subject to self-fulfilling crises. This was actually one of the recent Nobel Prizes in economics of Diamond and Dybvig. And they're subject to bank runs. One of the ways that you stop those self-fulfilling crises is the lender of last resort actions of the central bank. But the European Central Bank is really a interesting institution. First, it didn't have a clear assigned role as lender of last resort. Second, the Bundesbank objected to the role of the European Central Bank as lender of last resort. I don't think the Germans have it, or those Germans who, like Wiedemann, who opposed a lender of last resort capacity, had the macroeconomics right, in my view. They did not. But Europe was really limited in that basic central banking function. And under Trichet, it didn't perform lender of last resort functions, and that's almost brought the eurozone down. When Draghi came in, he de facto introduced the lender of last resort functionality, except in the case of Greece, which was a political target more than a macroeconomic object. So all of this is to say making a currency area work is both a matter of underlying politics, of fiscal policy, and of monetary policy. And Europe has most of what it takes to make it work, but it's very subject to the fact that even today, unbelievably, 67 years since the Treaty of Rome in 1957, Europe doesn't get along very well internally to this moment. And that means that a common currency is fraught with the challenges.
Yeah, there's so many internal differences between the member states, of course, linguistically, culturally, economically, but also in terms of interests. And yeah, I would say that the tragedy or the fate of Europe is that we should be united in order to actually become an effective global player, in order to compete against the US, Russia, China, India. But it seems like we're too divided to become that player, and that we are never able to get there. How do you see that?
Well, I see that exactly the same way you've just summarized it, which is that once upon a time, being a nation was a large entity because, of course, 2,000 years ago, we were dealing with the city-states often, but then came the Roman Empire. That kind of set a standard in the Western world in history. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was never united again in the way that it mostly was during the Roman imperial period. And Europe fought like hell with each other for more than 1,000 years. And for someone like me trying to appreciate this history and being a Europhile in general, and liking the different parts of Europe very much, it just seems very bloody-minded to me. But I would say that for a lot of modern European history, 17th, 18th, 19th century, Europe was the world. So the competition among the European powers was a competition among the imperial powers. There was imperial competition that led to lots of wars within Europe and lots of wars in other parts of the world between the European powers. But the whole point is that by now, being the Netherlands or being Denmark or even being France or Germany is not big enough in this world. By virtue of changes of technology which increase scale economies everywhere, and by the fact that we're globally interconnected, it's just like you say, Europe is now among some giants. The United States, relatively large, an economy that is comparable to the EU economy, let's say, but it's one country. And then we have China, India, Russia. So if Europe is going to be divided among 27 bickering countries, it's not going to stand much chance of autonomous action or security in a world of a few major powers. And those major powers are not going away. And they don't have Europe's interest at heart the way that Europe should. And so Europe should get its act together and actually cooperate. And it would understand things a lot better than it does now. There are many problems of European cooperation, but I would say that one is all the traditional enmities and divides. Second is, I won't use the expression old Europe and new Europe in terms of EU membership, but there are big differences of Western and Eastern Europe in political, geographic, cultural, and economic outlook. I've been involved very heavily in Eastern Europe over more than 30 years in this. Europe is very much weakened by its kind of chronic dependency on the United States. And many of Europe's politicians are basically bought off agents of the United States rather than really looking after Europe's interests. And so this idea of Europe as a vassal of the United States is sadly true. I say sadly as an American because I find American foreign policy to be pretty obnoxious most of the time and getting Europe into terrible problems. So Europe doesn't have a coherent view vis-a-vis the United States or vis-a-vis Russia or vis-a-vis China. And that's a shame because it leaves Europe quite exposed, quite divided, quite confused, and without effective political leadership. I can't think of one effective political leader in Europe right now.
They have no one to call, right? When you're in the US or China, you want to call someone. Then...
I know all these people for decades now, and I don't like what I see. I don't like what they say. I don't like how they interact. I think they've got Ukraine completely wrong. I think they've got China completely wrong. And I think they've got the United States completely wrong.
But if they got it so completely wrong, and we conclude that it's proven to be very difficult amongst all these member states due to all the difference to work together, wouldn't it be wise then completely reconsider Europe's strategy and think, okay, let's just go back to trade. That's what worked. And maybe let them all be sovereign, independent nations focusing on trade, neutrality, peace, and instead of trying to be this world power. Would that be maybe a smart move?
I don't think it's really feasible, actually, because Europe will get picked apart that way. The U.S. will use Europe for its own devices or the friendly governments. It will topple governments that it doesn't like. It will intervene. Russia will play games. China will play games. Remember China, which I like, by the way, I'm a Sinophile. But, China had its 16+1 arrangement where Central and Eastern Europe was very cooperative with China. I thought from a European point of view, that's a big mistake. This should be EU with China, not half of EU with China. And that's not because I'm against China. It's because I'm for Europe, finding its feet on the ground. So I don't think we're in a world in which individual nations, even linked by a free trade agreement or a single market, is enough anymore. I think we are in a world of regions, and the regions basically, China, but beyond China, it could become a Northeast Asia region of China, Japan, and Korea, actually on the same side. ASEAN will be a region, the Arab region, the African Union, the United States, which doesn't get along with almost anybody. But Europe needs unity. Now, what Europe is missing is some leadership, because there were periods during the construction of the community and then the union where I think there was real leadership and coherence. But right now there isn't. Right now the leadership is terrible. Van der Leyen is useless for Europe. She really is, just just in the hands of the U.S. State Department. It's really pathetic. Or NATO. I mean, maybe her highest aspiration was to head NATO, but it's pathetic because that's not what Europe is. And Scholz is obviously an extraordinarily weak chancellor of Germany. Macron, well, if you don't like what he says today, wait till what he says tomorrow. It's going to be different.
And Merkel, was she that type of leader that was able to sort of be a strong leader worldwide, where people could rely on, that people could call in whenever there was trouble?
I liked Merkel a lot. I thought she was solid and impressive. I liked Helmut Kohl a lot. I thought he knew what he was doing. And there are other leaders of Europe that I very much admired. Romano Prodi, both as European president and as Italian prime minister, was extremely capable and important. But right now, in Germany, France, Italy, the major traditional powers of the European Union, the leadership is absolutely insufficient, if not incoherent, and also so much under the thumb of the United States. It's really hard to understand and imagine. And Poland, where I worked a lot, I was their main economic advisor in the first years of the transformation. I helped Poland a lot. That deep Russophobia, maybe understandable, is not helpful for Poland's future or constructive right now.
Let's move to the Ukraine and what should be the coherent strategy for Europe. You've, of course, been very outspoken when it comes to how this war in Ukraine should be ended. You have very explicit and clear proposals for peace. Could you summarize how your ideal plan for peace would look like in Ukraine?
Look, the basic point is clear. Ukraine should have been a buffer zone between Europe and Russia, a safety zone between NATO and Russia. Didn't mean the end of Ukrainian sovereignty. In fact, the opposite. Nothing's wrong with neutrality. And neutrality worked just fine for Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland. And the reason it worked is Russia wanted a buffer the same way that the West wanted a buffer. And then the United States got it into its bloody head that we want Ukraine for us, and we want to be on Russia's border. And many hotheads in the United States wanted Russia to further disintegrate. 1991 wasn't enough, ending the Soviet Union. Now let's have Russia fall apart. And no doubt there was a strong CIA component of saying, we'll surround Russia, we'll weaken Russia, we'll do regime change. There are many crazy ideas in Washington. Now, Europe understood most of this. And when George W. Bush Jr. was pushing NATO enlargement in 2008 to Ukraine and to Bucharest, European leaders privately were saying to him, George, don't do that. And Europe's and U.S. top diplomats, like our current CIA director, William Burns, who in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, was writing back cables. This is absolutely a red line. Don't push NATO. But, you know, the U.S. is filled with stupid people in the security state. And they're arrogant. And they said, we won the Cold War. We can do what we want. We don't have to listen to anyone. We don't have to listen to Europe's leaders. We don't have to listen to Putin. We don't have to listen to anyone. Ukraine will become part of NATO. This is where we are. This is so obvious. Even Jens Stoltenberg admits this. He says it, but then the European leaders are either lying or stupid when they deny this. because NATO, no, it's not NATO. But Stoltenberg says, yes, this is a war about NATO. And then they don't have the common sense. If it's a war about NATO, is it really right that we go to the brink of nuclear war to make Ukraine part of NATO, as opposed to making Ukraine safe and neutral? And is it really true, as the propaganda has it right now? Oh, you can't be safe and neutral because Putin is either Hitler or Peter the Great or whatever nonsense is propounded by our propaganda in the West right now. It's sheer nonsense. If people actually understand the history of any of this, they will understand that the U.S. provoked. The Europeans knew it. They kept quiet because they're afraid of their overlord, the United States, their protector, their nuclear shield, whatever it is. So they don't speak honestly. But now I'm not sure that the current crop of leaders even understands this history. If you work a little bit at it, it's not so hard to understand. For me, I've seen it firsthand, close up over the last 30 years, because I was an advisor to Gorbachev, I was an advisor to Yeltsin, I was an advisor to Kuchma, the second president of independent Ukraine. I know these people. I know what happened. I know what European leaders have told me over the years. So all of this is to say, what's the answer to this? A neutral Ukraine. And why Macron or Scholz or anyone believes that NATO and Ukraine is either feasible or even the right thing to do if it were feasible absolutely bewilders me. And Jens Stoltenberg, whom I've known since he was Prime Minister of Norway, what the hell is he talking about with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians already dead? And he says, Ukraine will be part of NATO. Well, yes, Jens, over all of our dead bodies. Come on. So this is what this is about.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
Yeah, yesterday I interviewed Dick Berlijn, who's the former chief general of the Dutch army between 2005 and 2008. And he explained to me, or he laid out the argument why he thinks it's necessary to provide Ukraine with weapons and everything. He says, look, that narrative that Russia felt, or Putin felt obliged to invade because NATO was expanding eastwards, he says, no, it's the other way around, because people, especially in the East, expected Putin to at some point invade countries. They wanted to be part of NATO to avoid that fate, and see what happens. He invades Georgia, he invades Ukraine. So it made sense to expand NATO to counter that.
I don't think generals
wants to restore the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union borderlines.
I don't think generals know much about anything other than how to fight. But that is absolutely not the history at all. It's not the history at all. Putin was completely cooperative with Europe. But then the United States abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Then the United States, by the way, bombed Russia's ally for 78 straight days, Serbia, to break Serbia apart. Then the United States invaded Iraq. Then the United States called for NATO expansion to Ukraine and to Georgia. Then the United States sent the CIA in to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. Then the United States sent NATO in to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Then the United States placed Aegis missiles in Romania and Poland. Then the United States overthrew the government of Ukraine. Obviously, a U.S. concocted coup. If anyone understands it, I happened to see some of it close up. It was a U.S. operation. So the U.S. overthrows the Ukrainian government. The U.S. arms Ukraine. Then there is the Minsk agreements, and the United States, and now we heard from Merkel, Germany, France, the guarantors of Minsk, blow it off because Ukraine doesn't like it.
Yeah, and then March 22, of course, the peace treatment.
Yes, and it's all about Russia. Give me a break. maybe your general doesn't understand politics. I have no idea, but he doesn't understand this history at all, or he's not telling the truth.
And what about the next step? So let's say the support for Ukraine goes down. Fewer weapons are being delivered. We already see, of course, that Ukraine suffers on the front lines. Russia has much more firepower than Ukraine. I heard Medvedev saying that Russia may well go to Odessa, even Kiev. How far you think will Russia go in terms of conquering Ukraine?
It depends on what Europe and the United States actually do. If Europe and the United States, and especially the US, if we have a president that can do it, I'm not sure. This is one of our tragedies, but actually says with Putin, let's sit down and talk. Let's figure out how to make peace. Then the outcome will be vastly better. If instead the US and Europe keep escalating and Europe sends its troops in and all this rest of this stuff, then God help us. We don't know where it's going to end. But
yeah. So ceasefire is the important thing to start with. First, ceasefire.
Not the ceasefire. The important thing to start with is the idea that you need a negotiated peace. And by the way, European leaders are full of BS when they say, well, yes, it will be negotiated, but we need to fight now. What is fighting now? Why isn't there any serious attempt to discuss what this outcome could be? One reason is that not one leader dares to say, other than Orban and Fico, dares to say the truth, that Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO, and it's a bad idea, and we should say so in return for a sensible peace. That's been the missing idea all along. And I know that. I begged the White House in end of 2021, talk to Putin. Don't have this war. He's already proposed. Putin said, have peace with neutrality. And then the White House senior official said to me, no. NATO must have an open door. Why? Why? Does the U.S. accept an open door for Mexico and China, or Mexico and Russia, or Cuba and Russia?
No.
Well, no, we almost had a nuclear war over that one.
And it goes against the Monroe Doctrine, right? That
not only do we have a Monroe Doctrine over 201 years now, saying don't interfere in all of the Americas, but this is reiterated by American leaders in the UN General Assembly. I sit there and I listen to their speeches every September. And so the Monroe Doctrine is not a historical doctrine. Trump said it applies today. Well, can one European leader be honest about this and say, why don't we try to understand something from the other side, that Russia really doesn't want NATO on its 2,100-kilometer border, especially because the United States is addicted to regime change? It makes perfect sense to me.
So it'll be the first step is to be honest and accept the fact that Ukraine should not join NATO ever. What would be the subsequent steps then to, in the end, achieve a durable peace?
Well, just to say, if we had said that in December 2021, there would have been no war. That was essentially what Putin and Lavrov were saying. Neutrality, we avoid any kind of conflict. In March 2022, that's what was initialed between Russia and Ukraine. A deal, you look at the terms published recently by the Wall Street Journal and others of what was on the table. And I've talked to all the negotiators involved in this, not on the Ukrainian side. They don't talk to me, but the mediators, the Russians, the observers from the outside who were involved. Yeah, there was a deal. And the deal at that time was not even absorbing Donetsk and Lugansk at the time. It was neutrality And by the way, Crimea belongs to Russia. That was the terms of the deal. An excellent deal, because Crimea is not going back to Ukraine. And anyone that knows the history of it and knows the insanity of what's going on every day with Budanov and Zelensky saying, we're going to take Ukraine and we're going to corner Russia in the Black Sea, sounding like Lord Palmerston of 1856. Obviously, Russia's not going to retreat from that short of nuclear war. So what do we want? Well, there are people in the United States that just want ongoing war. Absolutely. They want it. They don't mind. 500,000 dead and wounded Ukrainians by now. Okay, it's not us. It's just our arms.
It's good for the industry, right?
It's a pittance. So this is part of what's going on. But for Europe, this is miserable. And it's escalating. And I'm waiting for just some honest voices. I know a couple of them, and I think Orban has been the most accurate European leader, direct, honest, and correct about all of this. And now you have Robert Fico next door in Slovakia, but you have crazy hotheads or U.S. vassals that are going to get everyone killed if they actually carry out what they're saying. And so, to come back to your point, the first step is to say, we need to end this war. We need to end the war, not on the battlefield. We need to end it through negotiations. Second, we have to be honest with ourselves and with Russia. What is this about? Well, we can just quote Stoltenberg. It's about NATO enlargement. Okay? It was a terrible idea. Some of our stupidest right-wing leaders in America were the authors of this. So Europe should understand that. You really want to go down because of Victoria Nuland? Honest to God? That's the second step. Some honesty. Third, okay, Russia, we don't want you stepping over anybody else's borders. We want demilitarization and protection. We're not after you or regime change, and you're not after us, and we got to stop the games. Now, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? That's actually a matter for the US and Russia to discuss. Here's a serious problem. I don't know whether Biden is physically able to do this. I don't mean ideologically. I don't know whether he's of a state of mind capable of doing this. We don't really know the situation in the United States right now with our own leadership. We need.
And do you believe Trump will take that decision?
I think Trump would probably take that decision, though I don't look at Trump, with much sense of stability. But I don't think Trump would continue the war this way. So I do think on this particular issue, he would basically go that direction. But what I would really have preferred, and what I argued with all my European friends, counterparts in the leadership, why didn't a few European leaders get together and explain to the United States, we don't want to go down over NATO enlargement to Ukraine. This was not a good idea. We tried, we bluffed, you overthrew a government, we armed, even they tried on the battlefield. This is a failing proposition. We got to do something different. And what we don't have is that group of European leaders that thinks clearly, speaks honestly, knows the history, and can bring this to a resolution. Because if the United States can't, Europe could.
Yeah, it's almost like they suffer from Stockholm syndrome, right, in Europe, because also Nord Stream was blown up by the US. Or
of course it was.
With the aid of the US, but it's also just being swept under the carpet and we don't talk about it. But and we condone everything coming from the US. So it's crazy how
Europe's
the leaders behave.
Europe is the big loser in this. It's interesting, by the way, the European public isn't fooled. It's just like the American public. They're against all of this, but foreign policy is not run in a democratic way where people actually listen to the public. And if you look at the approval ratings of European leaders, my God, there's not one European leader that is popular. Not one. So the public is very unhappy, and understandably so. But it just is really weird that we have such a dearth of honesty right now in Europe when it's most needed. I'm hoping we won't have van der Leyen any more after her term ends, and that someone else will replace her. The idea that she could be reappointed after having done more damage to Europe than just about anybody is a measure of how odd things are.
And we'll probably get Mark Rutte, our current prime minister, as the new head of NATO. But looking at your face, it doesn't make you particularly happy.
I would love a European to represent Europe.
Yeah,
I actually like Europe. I like Europe a lot more than I like.
Me too, and it also pains me to see the decay of Europe and the bad prospects. We're running out of time because I know you're on a tight schedule. I also wanted to discuss Gaza, but that's such a big topic also. Maybe you have some final remarks on that conflict also, on how to end it.
Look, the Gaza situation is that Israel is the most right-wing extremist government in the world. It is committing a genocide in Gaza before our eyes. I think the International Court of Justice will find that way when it makes its final decision. I don't think it takes a genius to understand what's going on. Israel has displaced 2 million people. It is starving to death hundreds of thousands of people. It has demolished mosques, hospitals, schools, universities, apartment complexes in Gaza. It's mass murder before our eyes. And one can understand it because this government in Israel is so extreme that we've never seen anything like it. And as an American Jew, I can tell you, looking at what is said, this is a kind of zealotry that is absolutely a profound, vulgar distortion of ethical values, because it's motivated by an incredible hatred of the Palestinian people, but more than that, by some feeling of the religious right to rule over the Palestinian people and take all the land. And that's what this is about. And again, it's denied in Europe because you're not allowed to say these things. But it's not a matter of anti-Semitism or not anti-Semitism. We have mass murder taking place before our eyes. And that absolutely should not happen. Period. It's not complicated. So what should have been done? The United States arms Israel every day. The U.S. could have stopped it any day. And what's amazing is Biden seems helpless. He says, oh, yes, they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do that. But I set no red lines. Why? Does Netanyahu run the U.S. government? Does the Israeli lobby run the U.S. government? Pathetic. This is what leadership is supposed to be. But again, Biden is very weak, maybe disabled. I don't know. We don't really know, but I'm pretty worried about the real state of affairs, both politically and with the vacuum of leadership in the United States. Now, what should happen? My own recommendation is the UN Security Council should vote immediately that Palestine is the 194th UN member state on the internationally recognized boundaries. That's the 4th of June, 1967 boundaries, with the capital of the state of Palestine in East Jerusalem. That's the international law. Vote it. Okay, the US will veto it, stand all alone. It goes to the General Assembly, overwhelming weight of world opinion that that's the solution. Even the US mumbles that that's the solution even though Biden is too weak, either politically or mentally or something, to enforce it. Bring it back to the Security Council, vote again until the U.S. stops blocking peace. Because this is not going to be stopped by Israel saying, oh, sorry, we did this. This is by design what they're doing. This is a government that wants to own and occupy the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. They're explicit about it. Again, it's not subtle. And so it's not going to be stopped by Israel. It's not going to be ended by negotiations between Israel and Palestine. It's going to be stopped by the UN Security Council. And it's going to be stopped when the United States stops being complicit in the killing.
Yeah, so the world needs to intervene, and hopefully all the build-up hatred will eventually go away, but it will take generations, both in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza.
But the faster it stops, the faster the healing begins. Yeah. Yeah. And this is it. You cannot run a world on hate in the nuclear age without risking destroying humanity. And we actually go day to day now with talk of nuclear war.
And we were very close in 2022. I heard, I read the other day, New York Times, we were on the brink of a nuclear war, or at least the start of it in 2022.
I completely resent all of these political leaders for putting our lives at stake rather than sitting down and negotiating, which is their damn job, because they are to represent our interests, not their games.
Well, great words to end the conversation with, Professor. Thanks so much for your time, your honesty, and your insights.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
As soon as
Let's
possible.
hope.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.